This is the fourth video for Chapter 1, corresponding to Section 1.6 in your textbook. At the end of this video, I hope you're able to use the 9 characteristics of living things to distinguish between living and non-living objects, explain why it's important to take physiological variation into consideration, define homeostasis, and explain why this concept is so important to physiology, differentiate between positive and negative feedback and give examples of both, and finally describe what a gradient is and be able to give some examples of gradients. So first, there are 9 characteristics of life. The first is organization, and it refers to an organism spending energy in order to maintain its own internal order. When an organism doesn't have enough energy to keep their internal structures organized and in good shape, the result is disease. We talked in a previous video about Schleiden and Schwann and how they proposed the beginnings of cell theory when they stated that all living things are made of cells. Here, we finalized that theory a bit, that all living things are made of one or more cells. Next, living things undergo chemical reactions called metabolism. Living things respond to stimuli. This is easy to picture in animals. But think of a plant that grows toward a window where light is coming from. Microorganisms can also respond to stimuli. Movement is a bit trickier because we can think of living things that don't appear to move. So movement refers to both the organism physically moving from one place to another and also substances moving within an organism. Homeostasis, one of the big focuses of this video, is the keeping of a constant, consistent internal environment, and we'll be talking more about that in a little while. Next, all living things grow and develop and generally differentiate as they grow. Reproduction is a pretty obvious task that all living things must do in some form or function. And finally, communities of living things experience changes in their genetics over time, and this is called evolution, like we've talked about briefly in previous videos. Remember that one individual can't change over time, but a community or population can change its genetic makeup over time in response to external pressures. Physiological variation refers to the differences between individuals, and we can make a very long list of physiological variations just in humans. Think about age and sex and weight, genetics, the environment that a person grew up in, currently lives in, and these different variations impact health and potentially the way a person will respond to medications or other interventions. Okay, so imagine for a second a man and a woman who are the same age, generally have the same level of fitness and daily aerobic activities. However, they need a different amount of calories in order to maintain their weight and their health. Living in a polluted area or living in an area with cleaner air to breathe can have a big impact on respiratory health. Smoking changes so many physiological factors. This is one of the things we're talking about now with COVID-19. Smoking increases the number of a certain receptor in the lungs called the ACE2 receptor. And the ACE2 receptor is where the novel coronavirus binds in the body and can start an infection. And that's why we see smokers disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and sometimes having worse outcomes than non-smokers. People often forget how important stress is in health. Whether a person has a high stress or a low stress life can have a big impact on their overall health. And blood pressure. Blood pressure seems so simple, but stress plays a role, gender plays a role, genetics plays a role, environment plays a role. Our blood pressure is impacted by a huge number of factors. Consider, for instance, if we were looking to test a new medication and our entire sample size was white men between the ages of 20 and 30. And after normal FDA testing, the medication is approved and the dosing requirements are calculated based on their sample size, the group of white men between the ages of 20 and 30. You can pretty easily imagine how anyone outside of that demographic might react differently to the particular medication. So historically, medicine has, in some cases, done a poor job of getting good samples for testing medications, and it's led to some negative outcomes. On to homeostasis. So homeostasis is a super important concept in physiology. So in short, homeostasis is the ability to detect changes in the internal environment and then activate mechanisms that maintain stable internal conditions. So I really like this graph that we have over here. It's a bit complicated, but let's see if we can work through it for a second. So what we have on the y-axis here is our blood glucose, our blood sugar level. Okay, so if you know someone who's a diabetic and they stick their finger or they have a continuous glucose monitor and they are checking their blood sugar throughout the day or at certain times in the day, as we eat, glucose is released into the bloodstream and then insulin is released from the pancreas and lowers the blood sugar. And then if the blood sugar gets too low, we have a release of glucagon, and that brings the blood glucose back close to the set point, and then maybe it rises a little too high and we need a bit more insulin released. And then here, we're going to eat another meal. If you notice time on the x-axis here, it's about lunchtime, we're eating another meal, and the blood sugar is going to go up again, and that's going to trigger the release of insulin. Homeostasis is the body's ability to keep the blood sugar in this fairly narrow range. Okay, that's homeostasis. We have mechanisms to detect changes in blood sugar, and then ways that we can influence the blood sugar to bring it back to the middle, either in this case insulin or glucagon. There are two different ways that we can have feedback in the body. We call these feedback loops. Negative feedback loops are much more common. A negative feedback loop keeps things at a narrow set point. Like your blood sugar stays in a range between about 90 and 110 for healthy people. When it gets high, we release insulin and blood sugar gets back down. When it gets low, we release glucagon, the blood sugar comes back up. Okay, so the body is able to sense these things and adjust accordingly. When we lose the ability to maintain homeostasis, this is when we have problems that can cause illness or death. If our body was not able to sense our blood sugar getting too high or too low, that could cause symptoms of high or low blood sugar. If we couldn't control homeostasis because either we stop producing insulin in the case of type 1 diabetes, or the insulin is not effective in our cells anymore in the case of type 2 diabetes, then we've lost homeostatic control and blood sugars can become very erratic, very high, very low. We can have some really negative health outcomes in that case. So let's look at another example of negative feedback. Okay, think about body temperature. If we get too warm, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to start sweating. And that sweating, the fluid that sweats out of us is going to evaporate off our skin, and that makes us feel colder. And that will bring our body temperature back down. If our body temperature gets cold, the muscles just under our skin are going to contract, and that's called shivering, and that generates heat and will bring our body temperature back up a bit. So negative feedback is centered on a central, very narrow set point, and all actions are trying to get back to that set point. And we have some diagrams here. If we compare humans regulating their body temperature to a thermos, if the thermostat notices that the temperature is too low, then the heat will turn on, and then the thermostat notices the temperature has risen, the heat shuts off. And we just talked about this with human body temperature. If we have human body temperature too low, we see shivering induced, and that raises the body temperature back up. If we go too far and we've gone into a situation where our body temperature rises, then we'll have sweating as a result. We can also see this with blood pressure. Blood pressure is also regulated by negative feedback mechanisms. Okay, so I'm sure everybody at some point has experienced standing up too quickly and you feel a bit lightheaded for just a second. So this happens when you stand up quickly and the blood drains from the upper body, and that throws off our homeostatic balance. Okay. Once we have that balance detected, the baroreceptors, baro means pressure, baroreceptors above the heart, they drop the blood pressure. That also sends signals to the cardiac center in the brainstem, right where the brain and the spinal cord kind of come together at the base of the skull. And that causes the cardiac center to just briefly accelerate the heartbeat, and that brings blood pressure back to normal, and you stop having that dizzy feeling after just a second. These aren't things that we consciously control. If I stand up too quickly after sitting and watching Big Bang Theory for a couple hours, I don't think to myself, okay, baroreceptors, you need to respond to this drop in blood pressure, and okay, cardiac center in my brainstem, you need to make my heart beat faster. These are things that happen outside of our conscious control. These are things that are automatic responses that are regulated for us without our conscious knowledge. The other type of mechanism that we have is called a positive feedback loop. And this one's really neat. The classic example here is childbirth. So let me talk you through the example, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about what it means in terms of the formal definition. Okay, so if we have this picture of a woman who is in the process of having a baby, in a normal situation, the baby's head is pointed downward towards the cervix and is pushing against the cervix. And with every contraction, the head pushes against the cervix. That sends a message to the brain that stimulates the production of oxytocin, and the oxytocin is secreted, and the oxytocin causes stronger and more frequent contractions, which push the baby's head against the cervix more frequently and with more pressure, and that sends the same impulse back to the brain. We have more oxytocin released, more contractions, and this is a positive feedback loop. You guys have seen, at least in TV shows, that contractions come faster and faster and stronger until the baby is born in a normal, healthy situation. This is a positive feedback loop. As soon as the baby's born and the head of the fetus is no longer pushing against the cervix, the signals to the brain stop, the oxytocin stops in such great quantities, and the feedback loop is terminated. So let's go back one side. We call this a self-amplifying cycle. Okay, in this case, all of our changes are going in the same direction. We're going towards increased pressure on the cervix. We're going towards more oxytocin release and eventually birth of the child. Okay, so this feedback loop is also repeated. Okay, so each change produces more of the same change. Each contraction produces more pressure on the cervix and more oxytocin release, which makes more contractions and more pressure on the cervix and more oxytocin release. Okay, so there are a few systems in the body where a positive feedback loop is necessary to produce a change, and then the change is done. This can become dysfunctional. Okay, there are times that a fever can get higher, and then the signal is sent to continue elevating the body temperature, and the fever gets higher, causing a signal to get sent to continue elevating the body temperature. Sometimes this can become dysfunctional and can be very disastrous to health. But in the case of childbirth and some other things here, it's the normal, useful way of using a positive feedback loop. Our last concept is the concept of a gradient and flow across a gradient. So this principle is really simple, but the wording can be kind of confusing. So let's start with the word gradient. Gradient is anything where there's a gradual difference between 2 points. Okay, so I'd like you to imagine a room on a hot summer day in your house, and there's one part of the room that has an air conditioner in it, and if the air conditioner is on, working properly, that's going to be the coldest part of the room. On the other hand, if there's a window getting direct sunlight, maybe on the west side of the room, that's going to be the hottest part of the room. And then we'll have a gradual temperature change between the hottest part by the window and the coolest part by the air conditioner. Okay, so that's an example of a gradient. Let me give you a physiological example of a gradient. Okay, so imagine your heart is pumping blood through your arteries and then capillaries and back through your veins. Okay, so the place where your blood pressure is going to be the highest is in the arteries just past the heart. Okay, right there where the heart has just pushed the blood into the arteries, that's where you're going to have the highest pressure. And then throughout the circuit, through all of the small arteries and into the capillaries and then the small veins and then into the large veins, we're going to have the lowest blood pressure in the veins where the blood is about to return to the heart. And we'll see a smooth, gradual change in blood pressure from the arteries close to the heart to the veins close to the heart. Okay, so those are just two examples of gradients. In general, things flow down a gradient without the use of any energy and have to be pushed up a gradient using energy. Okay, so in the example of our heart here, we have energy input at the heart, and then the pressure in the arteries and then the veins returning flows down. And we can see this on a much smaller scale too. So if we go back to talking about our glucose in our blood, and we're trying to get that glucose into the different cells so that it can metabolize, this happens automatically. There's no energy needed. We have a high concentration of glucose in the blood outside of the cell, a low concentration in the cell, and so the glucose is going to move from high concentration to low concentration without any energy needed to be put in. Okay, sometimes we'll have a cell membrane channel that works as kind of an open gate where ions can flow through from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. We also see a heat gradient from our veins and arteries that are deep inside of our tissues with a lower temperature on our skin surface.